Welcome and good afternoon to all. We are so very pleased that you're able to join us. Before we go any further, I would simply like to state that we respectfully acknowledge all Native American peoples who have lived on this land since time immemorial. TCU especially acknowledges and pays respect to the Wichita and affiliated tribes upon whose historical homeland our university is located. My name is Dr. Frederick Gooding Jr., aka Dr. G, and I am chair of TCU's Race and Reconciliation Initiative. We are an academically based, research-focused initiative designed to study TCU's relationship with slavery, racism, and the Confederacy. Now, any questions that are outside of our scope, we will simply redirect them to the appropriate parties, but we are so very glad that you are with us to engage in a very powerful conversation about reconciliation. In fact, this is one of the last town halls in our series in which we simply went all around the world, or all around the campus, if you will, asking various colleges, all 9, plus the School of Medicine, plus TCU Athletics. And so therefore, we cannot forsake our good brothers and sisters over at Brite Divinity School, as we do have a relationship. And so what we're doing is we're asking everybody, what does reconciliation mean to you? As we continue to proceed down this path, we are very pleased to be joined by members of the Brite Divinity School to share their valued perspective. But before we hear from those members, I would like to introduce a very important individual who's taken some time out to share a few words about Brite Divinity School and what it means. After I introduce this individual, you all would then be graced, if not blessed, by the mellifluous, magnificent, and marvelous voice of none other than Mr. Marcellus Perkins, who will then introduce our guests and then hold court through some interviews. And then I will come back with some very important announcements because hint, hint, Reconciliation Day is a-coming. But before we go on to the regular program, I simply would like to introduce Dr. Michael Miller, who joined the Brite Divinity School in 2019 as Executive Vice President and Dean. He also serves as an Associate Professor of Theology. He's an ordained minister in a Christian church, Disciples of Christ, that is, and is a graduate in the University of the West Indies. He also obtained his degree from Columbia Theological Seminary and Claremont Graduate University, PhD. He is the author of Freedom and Resistance and Creative Transformation and Reshaping the Contextual Vision in Caribbean Theology. And although he has yet to make a plate of jerk chicken, of which I can attest to, he is absolutely a brother from another mother that we're very pleased to welcome to the space, Dean Michael Miller.
Thank you very much, Dr. G. It is my pleasure to be here and participating. Greetings to TCU staff, students, faculty, and friends participating in this Race and Reconciliation Town Hall. As Dean at Brite Divinity School, I'm very appreciative of the opportunity provided to highlight our long-standing involvement and leadership in matters relevant to race and reconciliation. Having been birthed by TCU, Brite has operated with its own charter that gives it the freedom and responsibility to pursue concerns that reflect the challenge expressed in Jesus' first identified sermon portrayed in Luke 4. The Spirit of God is on me, because God has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. God has sent me to proclaim freedom to the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of God's favor. The founders and early leaders of TCU, who are mostly connected to the community now called the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, with their many flaws, understood that discerning who are the poor, the prisoner, the blind, the oppressed, in any period, and privileging their interests would always be a challenge in any human institution and community, be it church, divinity school, university, city, or nation, and could sometimes generate tension and even turmoil. Yet these pioneers were of the conviction that persons called as leaders in any sphere of the world, which they understood to be God's world, and especially those given the responsibility to prepare leaders for service guided by Jesus' values, should always consider the concrete implications of the disciples' prayer that includes the words, "Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven." This being so, we at Brite are constantly challenged to pursue this ideal and accept the associated obligations and the challenges. Therefore, even when Brite knew it would upset persons involved in the wider life of TCU, Fort Worth, and Texas, our understanding of discipleship to Christ has made us willing to take significant risks at different periods of our existence on this campus. Thus, we organized accommodation for Martin Luther King when the usually expected means were denied him. We took the lead in accepting African Americans as ministerial students and provided a haven for them when they were not viewed as acceptable anywhere else on our campus. We also took the lead in providing housing for some same-sex couples when the technicalities of state legislation generated major hurdles, and we collaborated with TCU to extend insurance benefits to same-sex partners. When our decision to collaborate with local African American congregations to honor Dr. Jeremiah Wright was viewed as completely unacceptable because he utilized language reminiscent of ancient Israelite prophets to denounce American racism. We went ahead in the face of threats of violence and exile, also reflective of our understanding of the poor and oppressed in our time, is the fact that concurrent with this town hall meeting is a Brite-sponsored virtual panel discussion addressing the murderous violence that has been directed against transgender people in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex and elsewhere. In adopting these stances, Brite understands itself to be guided by the ethical foundations generated from the spiritual heritage bequeathed to all connected with TCU by those who were committed to Christian discipleship above all else. This spirit is reflected in Brite's decision and its vision of a world transformed by God's love, mercy, and justice, and in the accompanying values of academic excellence, inclusive justice, and life-giving practice. It is in this spirit that we participate in the race and reconciliation process and commit to ongoing engagement as part of the TCU community. And it is in this spirit that I anticipate an enlightening and transformative conversation over the next hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dean, for gracing us with that wonderful introduction. At this point, I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists for this afternoon. Dr. Jeremy Williams is an assistant professor of New Testament. Dr. Barbara McClure is an associate professor of pastoral theology and practice. Panelists, thank you for joining us today. How are you?
Thank you.
Well, absolutely. So for our first question, we like to start off with a very simple, straight to it. How would you all define reconciliation, or what does the word reconciliation mean to you? Whoever wants to jump out there first.
Dr. Williams?
Okay. Well, one thing that I think about in my work as a Bible scholar is how do we use texts like the Bible and the New Testament to think about and to ponder our world, particularly in terms of big issues like race relations, as well as how humans understand differences and how those differences have been negotiated across time, whether it's in the first and second century CE or in contemporary American discourse. And so part of the way that I think about reconciliation in line with my work is what are the types of ethnic negotiations that have occurred across time and history, and how can the Bible be resources both for our thinking about how we come together to deal with the damage and results of domination and exploitation, and how do we expect for oppressed people to engage with their oppressors, with their colonizers in some type of fruitful and helpful dialogue, and in what ways biblical texts can be resources for doing that kind of work. And so that's part of how I think about reconciliation.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm not a biblical scholar. I work at the intersection of psychology, religion, and culture, but I do agree with Dr. Williams and what his comments. I think as a person with white skin and white privilege, reconciliation for me is sort of a goal that's out there, and that I feel a responsibility to think about and address reparation first. I think it's incumbent on those who are the dominators and the colonizers to think about ways to try to we can't undo the damage that we have done, but we can help create visions and systems and material realities that help some healing. And I think so for me as a white person, reconciliation is a pretty far off goal. I hope for it. I hope I can be a part of it, but it's past the step of reparation in my view.
Interesting. I'm also curious for you all. Earlier in the semester, Dr. G and I had the privilege of interviewing Dr. J. Augustine, who is a pastor and also is a theologian based out of North Carolina. And we kind of explored the concept of reconciliation through a biblical sense. So for you all, in a biblical sense, or even through a religious sense, what does reconciliation mean within that context?
Well, I think what's tricky about that is, in part of what our approach to biblical studies is that what we read in the text depends heavily on where you sit, and the way that the reconciliation looks, it will look different depending on who it is engaging the text, what it is that they expect to get out of it, and what types of questions are they bringing to their approach of biblical text, and so to that end, in line with what Dr. McClure mentioned, what for me is more important about what more important than how the Bible speaks to reconciliation is what do we look to the Bible to tell us? what questions are we engaging? And I think that if the questions are around how do we make up for harm, then one of the biggest things is that those who are in power, who have done the damage, need to really wrestle with the real consequences of those actions.
Interesting.
Can I answer that quickly?
Yeah,
too?
absolutely, Dr. McClure. Yes, please.
Dr. Williams is the biblical scholar here. I am not. But when I read the text, especially the New Testament, and I look at the life of Jesus of Nazareth, who was a leader in the Jewish community, I see him breaking barriers to flourishing and well-being, whether it's for women or for non-Jews or outcasts for various reasons. I see him breaking down the ways that the system had excluded and misrepresented and underrepresented those people, and he brings them into a kind of community. And I think that's so the breaking the barriers is part of the reparations that I mentioned in my first answer.
Yeah, and to kind of piggyback off of that, you make a good point of breaking down the barriers and entering community. So now that we kind of have some of understanding of like the definitions in which ways our panelists view the word reconciliation, I would be interested to know, how does that inform you all's work? your professional career, even in the community, in your personal careers? Or how does the word reconciliation inform the way in which you do your work? And I could pitch it back to Dr. McClure, since that was her word I piggybacked off of.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I try to attend to include underrepresented voices, for example, in the classroom, not just for my students, make sure that my underrepresented students in the classroom feel included and welcome and valued and respected and dignified in my classroom, but to have texts that we are reading both from a perspective of the underrepresented, but also looking at white privilege. I think so. Racism is not a Black people problem. It's not a brown people problem. It's a white people problem. We have instituted these policies, these social systems, these laws that diminish, demean, and act in violent and domineering and dominating ways against people of color. It is incumbent on us to understand our part in that and to hear the effects of that from the people who are most closely impacted. So I try to do that in the classroom. There are other ways, but I'll stop there.
Dr. Williams.
Well, I think for the most part, I address a number of ways that I do this in one of my first responses, but to accent something that Dr. McClure mentioned, is making sure that on our syllabuses or syllabi, there's a wide representation of voices and of thoughts and various intellectual traditions that allow for us to hear the voices that are, often people talk about voices that are unheard, but it's really voiceless people, but it's actually voices that have been muted. And so part of the work that I do is to try to amplify those voices that otherwise would get ignored.
Yeah, and I think that, both of y'all kind of harp on two important parts. A lot of times when we talk about race and reconciliation, one of the central things we always say is, what are the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves? And in that, there's another secondary question of whose story is being excluded, or whose voice is being excluded, or whose story is being excluded. And what work are we doing to kind of reconcile or bring those stories and names to light? In particular, when we talk about TCU and TCU's history and culture, that is one thing that we're harping on with race reconciliation, is whose story has been excluded. So for you all, just kind of slight transition, when we think about TCU in general and overall, what do you all think Brite's relationship is to the greater campus community? Because sometimes there's confusion of, is Brite TCU? Is Brite not TCU? They're across the street, but they're not necessarily, so for you all, what is Brite's relationship to TCU?
Well, I'm quite new here, so I can only speak very briefly, and I'll lean into Dr. McClure. And as the dean mentioned earlier, it seems that Brite has historically had a very close relationship to TCU, but there's been a number of issues, as he noted. But one thing that I think is important about this relationship is, especially with the values that Brite has toward being a progressive liberal seminary that engages with issues around racial justice as well as LGBTQIA justice, that it's a very useful resource to be just across the street. And we could do way more to cross-pollinate.
Right.
Yeah, I like the idea of more cross-pollination. I would like to have more opportunities to cross the street, as people say. I've been around a little bit longer than Dr. Williams, but as the dean noted, I think Brite historically has been a model. I think we try to continue to be a model. We try to, excuse me, teach people to think critically about their own social location, both among the privileged and among the disadvantaged or the underrepresented or the muted, to borrow Dr. Williams. And I think we will continue to live into those values. All of my faculty colleagues and staff are committed to these values, and it's our hope that the students who join us will come to understand why we're so committed to those values. And I think we can do more to share what we're doing, what we're trying to do, and invite more people in, both from the TCU campus, but the wider DFW community.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dr. McClure, since you've noted that you've been here a little bit longer than Dr. Williams, I'll pitch this question to you first. This may give him a little bit more time to think about it. But in regards to the efforts of reconciliation and your personal work, in what areas are you looking to improve upon at Brite Divinity?
Well, there's always room for improvement. One of the things I'm committed to is making sure that our library houses resources from, again, under-resourced communities, from scholars of color, from scholars around the globe who have a different perspective than maybe we do in North Central Texas. That's one thing we continue to try to improve. I think we can do better, again, partnering with TCU and making this campus, our joined campuses, sort of a beacon on a hill for awareness and activism and education, and highlighting the ways that current systems, one might call them neo-capitalist systems, that can accommodate race in really harmful ways. I think the ways that has infused itself into Brite Divinity School and maybe TCU as well. So kind of keep naming the issues and the ways that we are implicated, and find ways to address those meaningfully and material.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Williams, what say you?
One thing that I think is extremely important, both within my work and something that's Dr. McClure mentioned we can always move toward in better ways, is thinking about inclusive pedagogy, and making sure that our classroom spaces are places where we engage multiple intelligences, especially around these particularly I study race and criminalization antiquity. And so granting students various methods to think through these complicated issues, and to use venues, whether it's art or poetry or sculpture or music, or thinking about how do we take these really important concepts, these difficult theories, and make them so that they're palatable to people beyond the academy, is something that I think is extremely important. That if our work is not just something that gets proclaimed by us from our lecture pulpit, but actually gets within the students in their own practice, but then where they can incorporate that to actually make the world into a place where there's more justice, love, and wholeness. And so some of the reason why, when I think back on my earlier response around your question around reconciliation, that I had a bit of an idiosyncratic answer, is because part of what I think my role in this, and part of what I think the role of higher ed in particular is to help people to actually think, to see what the problem actually is, so that the real problem can be addressed and not just bandaged over.
And just a quick follow-up to that. Why or how do you think it is so easy for these issues to be bandaged over as opposed to deeply explored?
Well, one issue is that we don't want to tell the truth. And I believe, and part of my work engages using critical race theory. And
don't say those three words too loud.
And that exactly. And that's where we find ourselves at this moment in our nation, where deep inquiry is brought under scrutiny. I gave a talk at a regional meeting recently where I said, I believe the real challenge to the term critical race theory is not race, it's critical.
I mean, I think you would have to just go a little bit deeper into that as well. I mean, why would you make that type of assertion?
Well, part of what becomes part of public discourse is the idea that people can investigate the master narratives that have been perpetuated and have been presented. So the idea that we can question the quote unquote founding fathers holding of slaves and question whether or not that's just or not. The fact that we can question whether or not having Confederate statues are history, or if they are tokens of oppression, right? To ask the questions are the problems.
And you would think at a institution of higher education where our job is to explore the truths and realities of situation, that these things should be a model. Like we should be a model of what it means to explore and ask those very critical questions of our truths and realities, to say, like, what is the impact or influences of these past phenomenons, and how are they showing up in our present day and also dictating our current future. So I definitely appreciate your analysis and your willingness to share how and why this idea of us bandaging things over is really faltering. It really has no help, and it has no room here if our job as higher education professionals, regardless of the discipline, aren't willing or able or equipped with the tools to really explore the whys of the impacts and influences of our truths and realities. And one thing that I'm also very curious from you all, and I'll pitch this one to Dr. McClure to start. What efforts at Brite Divinity are being explored in regards to diversity, equity, inclusion that you're able and willing to share with us today?
Yeah, I want to pick up on your earlier question before I answer this one, if I
Yeah,
could.
absolutely.
So my comment earlier about neoliberal capitalism, I think critical race theory in part challenges the all-American ideal that we have what we have because we worked hard, because we earned it, because we deserve it, because whatever. I mean, all the narratives, to your point.
Or you're suffered by the bootstraps.
Right, exactly.
Right.
All the narratives we tell ourselves about our success. And I think part of the resistance to critical race theory and agreeing with Dr. Williams on the critical piece is that we have to look, those of us from privileged and dominating groups have to look at how the system is built to benefit us. And that's a hard thing. And as a psychologist, I am really interested in what it takes for people to give up something. I think we among privileged groups have to give something up to make space for others. I think that's part of the problem with climate change. We all are going to have to give some things up that we've become accustomed to and have enjoyed. So that's part of to your second question, part of what I think Brite does well, and I try to do, and I know Dr. Williams tries to do as well as our other colleagues, is first raise awareness. Sort of pull away the veil to see the way reality is different from the stories that we tell. And then to ask the questions, what do we do about that? These things have deep roots and long histories. What can we do in our spheres of influence? Because it can get overwhelming. So I try to remember, I have certain spheres of influence. How do I move into those spaces with integrity? How do I live the values that Dean Miller named at the start of this hour today that resist some of the values around neo-capitalism or neoliberal capitalism or money or success as a value? I think the Bible's pretty clear about the shifting sand of those values. What other values do we want to live and teach and advocate for?
Dr. McClure, you said something very profound that I kind of wanted to follow up with you. You said, and I might got the quote wrong, but just this idea of people being hesitant or fearful of giving something up, that you have to have a willingness to give something up in order to, even the playing fields or give people opportunities, or to just even see how a system unfairly benefits certain groups over another. For your perspective, why do you think it is so hard for people, even when they are aware of their benefits and privileges, still are hesitant to give something up? Is it that maybe they don't know what to give up or how to give it up, or they just don't care enough to give it up?
Wow. I think that right there is the $1 million question, to be honest. And it's a really complicated one. I think both of the possibilities you named are probably true. People don't know what to give up. They don't know how what they give up might affect the whole system. And they don't probably care enough. And I would relate this to our approach to climate change. It doesn't I don't want to give things up.
Right.
I've built a life, or I have been given in part a life that I enjoy. And to think of living differently or making certain sacrifices, it's not something that I relish. And yet, if I can be helped to see that the ways the current system is hurting all of us, including me, the
Mm.
current system that both privileges me
Mm.
and oppresses and targets others also hurts me, because I don't think we can all be well and flourish unless we're all flourishing. And so,
Right.
the famous quote, I think it's from MLK Jr., as long as some are floundering, everybody is floundering. A threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So I think we have to be able to see that in our own personal lives, but also then systemically and social politically.
And just another quick follow up, because I've seen you've mentioned this twice. This idea of neo-capitalism, and exploring that even through like a religious set of lens. Like how do you get to that point, or how do you kind of use your expertise to kind of analyze that concept and phenomena to explain power dynamics, injustices, and oppression?
I feel like
Can
this
I? Oh,
Dr. Williams, yeah, this is Dr. Williams' purview. I'm going to hand it over
okay.
to him.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I was going to jump in tag team here.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, jump in.
And I think a good response to this, and I think also to Dr. McClure's reflections, and how do we think about addressing these issues.
Mm.
Here, I'm going to use an old-fashioned Bible word,
Okay.
repentance.
Okay.
The Greek word is metanoia, which literally means not just kind of to ask forgiveness, but it's a change in mind that leads to a transformation in conduct. And so part of what is really demanded of us, and part of what I would even argue that Jesus of Nazareth proposed, is that people have to recognize that the current way that they see the world is alienating them from each other and from God. And part of the work that we are doing in the divinity school, and part of the work I think that we do as critical thinkers, embracing that notion of Jesus as a philosopher, is to convince people that the current way of seeing the world, of this neoliberalism that emphasizes privatization and individualism at the expense of the whole, this notion that humans should be treated as tools of production and herded like cattle, that is not the best vision of the world. And we are so indoctrinated in that we really have to repent. we have to do a 180 and say that the way that we see things are not the way they are, similar to like Socrates and Plato's myth of the cave, where what we are seeing is not what really is.
Right.
And that's the difficulty, that we are living in an illusion. And part of this illusion is race. But it's not, that does not mean, and that's part of the structural concern, right? It's not that race doesn't exist,
right?
But it's an illusion that has been created, and it wields power over real human bodies. And that's the analogy. We got to change if we really want to embrace the divine homeland.
And if I could just add to my
absolutely,
building on what Dr. Williams just said, I think being in the cave, I think our view, many of our views are short term and very narrow. So we're not thinking long term, and we're not thinking globally. We're thinking about our house, our family, our neighborhood, maybe our church. And that's a really limited perspective on what I think the sacred texts call us to consider, which is a global family, neighbors, and the well-being of all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of gives us a good segue to this next question I wanted to ask. When we're thinking about larger visions and kind of honing it back to Brite Divinity, in your mind, what is your vision for a more equitable Brite Divinity school? What would that look like?
For me, it's really addressing the systems, both of our institution, around hiring, around the students we invite, around, as Dr. Williams mentioned, the our pedagogies in the classroom? How do we teach students? How do we not just welcome them to campus, but include them in the power structures of the ways this institution runs? So and then how do we continually take risks, as Dean Miller said, and be a model, not just for TCU and Fort Worth, but for theological education. The church can be a fairly conserving place. And I think Brite has done a very good job historically to move the ball forward on more progressive issues of inclusion and diversity as a desirable and valued norm.
Absolutely. Dr. Williams, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that as well?
And it might seem that we came here to beat the late capitalist neoliberalism drum, but
That's okay.
that was not the intention.
That's
but,
okay.
But within that framework, in order to like get messages or to get ideas and to make concepts more realized is resources. And part of the challenges that we kind of can see in the way that universities are structured is that there are some departments and programs that have access to way more funding that oftentimes don't foster the type of critical thinking and questions that we are attempting to engage. And part of what could help this work, help the place to be more equitable is for both institutions, both TCU and Brite, to really invest and put their money where their mouth is to do the work of saying, if we really want to do this work to increase this consciousness, to get the speakers, to create the departments, to fund the programs, that if we really recognize that injustice has been done, and that if we think about kind of the ways that we use the language of acknowledging the ground that has been mercilessly taken from the indigenous people that live here, we really take seriously how the people who founded the school were in support of the lost cause, that like we really have to actually say, are we going to invest in doing the work of helping to remedy that type of harm? And so part of the longer range questions are, especially on the Brite side, is how do we actually live up to our principles with our budget, and realizing that budgets are moral documents.
And I wanted to ask just because every time you all speak, another question kind of pops up in my mind. But what is you all's perception on this idea that the church should be neutral in regards to political issues? I know that's a lot of times thrown into the news selectively at times, but in this idea of the church should just be the church and should not hold or be a place of political grounds or have political opinions. How do you all kind of reconcile with that idea as well?
Dr. Williams, you want to take that first?
I believe it was Martin Niemöller who said that evil prevails when good people do nothing. And I'm quite convinced that the gospel itself is political, that there is no neutrality, especially in the face of injustice. And so generally the calls to domesticate and silence the voice of congregations, it happens like generally when they are advocating for justice and social change. Now, allow me to make sure that I hedge my bet here and talk about it especially since the 80s, a different movement in Christian churches has been co-opting what had traditionally been the more prophetic critical voice of congregations, and that more conservative right-wing evangelicalism has in many ways polluted public discourse. And so part of what I'm saying is that that it's always political. So the question is less, should they remain neutral, but which side our church is going to be on.
I can't not improve on that. The only thing that's a great answer that I wholeheartedly support. The only thing I would add is that I see the church as part of the role of the church is educational.
Mm.
And critically reflective. And that's what I hope we're training our students who will be moving out as religious leaders into the world. I hope we're training them to do that. So otherwise, I fully agree with Dr. Williams. It's already political. The question is in what ways and on what side, and for whose benefit, for whose benefit.
Whose benefit? Absolutely. I mean, I really appreciate the answers. I'm so glad that we record these sessions so people can kind of review them, refresh themselves. That's something I like to do. Once we finish the town hall, I like to go rewatch it. Don't like listen to myself speak, but just more so everything, really take time to hear what the panelists had to say. Another question, and kind of pivoting slowly, when you all heard of Race and Reconciliation Initiative that TCU was undertaking this type of study, what were some of you all's first thoughts on that of hearing RI?
One of mine was good. We need to have more conversations. We need to underscore the ways that TCU is trying to right some wrongs, that it's trying to make space for people who have been muted in the past, that it's trying to highlight and highlight awareness. And as I shared at the top of our time together, I think reconciliation cannot happen without some kind of reparation. And I hope that, with all due respect to Dr. Gooding, Dr. G, and his office, I hope that those conversations will also happen. It's not enough. I mean, Rodney King's voice, "Can't we all just get along?" It's ringing in my head. It's not enough to get along. We have to do better around systemic, violent, and dominating systems, economic, political, social, healthcare. I mean, all the systems that exclude and oppress millions and billions of people. And that's the part of the reparative work that I hope that we will do more of.
And the only thing that I could add to that, 'cause I think that's 100% spot on, is that I believe that that I encountered this through Dr. G, and I believe that he's a fantastic spokesperson for this work and this initiative. His energy is infectious,
Yeah.
and I think that that's the type of energy that we need to get this type of work done. That as we note, and as Dr. McClure just mentioned, it's a long journey, but a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. And I think that having the energy and having the excitement and to do this kind of interdisciplinary cross-campus work to move us into a more just place is extremely remarkable. So those are my initial thoughts.
So after your initial thoughts and you all being at TCU for a while and seeing some changes in regards to culture or leadership, admin, what at all encourages you about the direction TCU is undertaking in regards to its diversity, equity, inclusion? Like what have you seen that is encouraging you to say, like, hey, we're moving in the right direction? And what also gives you pause?
You want to start that one, Dr. Williams?
Sure. One thing that that is encouraging is part of that piece I raised about the critical, to actually do history or to really engage in any meaningful way. You have to ask questions, because history is often less about the past and more about the present. How are we telling the story of who we are by who we've been, right? Is really what history does, or at least from my vantage point. And so I think that that's really good. The only challenge that I would want to raise is to make sure that that our motives for telling who we are in the present are always to tell us who we really are, and not just who we want to be.
I had to sit with that one for a little bit. Dr. McClure, is there anything that encourages you or gives you pause in regards to diversity, equity, inclusion?
Yeah,
campus?
there's a lot that encourages me, and I'm on the other side of the street, so I don't know a lot, or I don't know everything that's going on at TCU, but I am encouraged by naming some realities. The fact that, as Dr. G started us off with today, we sit on land that was violently appropriated from indigenous peoples. That's an important thing to name and to have in our awareness and consciousness.
Mhm.
The effort to offer scholarships to underserved, underrepresented people, to help bring them into this place and make them full partners in the work of this institution. Some things that give me pause. Again, the naming that we are on violently appropriated indigenous land. It's not enough to name that. That's a first step. But how do we make reparative? How do we do the reparative work to support the communities who have been moved west, who
Right.
live, for example, on arid, unlivable land because we took this rich part of North Central Texas? How do we support those communities in ways that are meaningful to them? And I think TCU did a really good job in including people, representatives from those indigenous groups in the work of recognizing the land that we're on. I was really glad to see that. So, there are some good steps being made, and awareness is probably the first one. The next one, I hope, will be, what do we do about that? What is
What
our
do we do about that?
responsibility in the face of that,
Mm.
in these communities who are still our neighbors?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of which, the way from our vantage point, the way we approach this work is that we have to have transparency before accountability.
Yeah.
To say, these are the things that have happened. These are the truths and realities of our history and our past. And this is what makes us today. Now we can be held accountable for these things, but also held accountable to the direction we say we want to move in. And from there, we can make those very calculated, actionable steps towards reconciliation, towards healing, towards this more equitable campus or greater city or greater society, however you want to turn that into a macro. But I do, appreciate you all's insightfulness. One thing that I think is so powerful about these conversations we've had is that from each different college or each different body on campus, whether it's from science and engineering or the business school or college education, it shows that all of these different lenses can be useful in this idea of reconciliation, whether it is through theology or the science. Like it's all of it can be used. We just had an event last week about incorporating the curriculum of race reconciliation into the curriculum. And if you're creative, there is ways to weave in these conversations because because race is part of every piece of fabric of our country and our world. So there are ways to talk about it. So I just want to say I appreciate you all's willingness to share this additional lens, because this is our official last virtual town hall series of the academic year. And I think it's very well fitting that we incorporated and invited our good people from across the street, but yet on campus at Brite Divinity. And as before we close, there's this section that I would like for us to do. It's more of the fun rapid fire piece that I'll ask you all two quick questions, and in a very short responses as possible. If you were president of Brite, what would you change first?
Dr. McClure.
The marketing of what we do. We have
marketing.
a lot of important events. We have had historically, as you heard from Dean Miller, we're a pretty active community. We do a lot here. And I saw in the chat, Dr. G asked the question, how could we partner better with TCU? I would love to see more partnering, meet more people. I'm so happy to meet you all today and to engage with you a little bit. And what ways could we partner and collaborate, and then broadcast the good work that's already being done and will be done in the future?
Yeah. Dr. Williams.
And I would actually just have to put a check mark plus next to that, because all of this great work, a lot of it goes without being known. If we could just advertise the work of Brite and Race and Reconciliation Initiative, the way that we advertise for football games,
Uh-oh.
we would change Fort Worth like this.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
Like this.
Well, I guess that only Dr. G just flew in on the helicopter. But what I wanted to ask you all, since you brought it up, how would you get people excited for Reconciliation Day, which is on 4/20? See right there. It's on 4/20. How would you get people excited about Reconciliation Day the same way we do about a TCU home football game?
Well, I'm gonna repeat what Dr. Williams just said. Resource it,
Yeah.
advertise it, help people understand. I mean, this is the cynical psychologist in me, but people don't tend to do something unless they see what's in it for them. So helping the entire community see what's in it for all of us to address these challenges and these inequities and these injustices. So, and I deeply believe it will be better for all of us if we can move toward a more just and flourishing world.
And my response might be that is more long range, in that as we get excited about this one, that if we, after the 20th, we start advertising the next one, because part of the imagination, and even ever since I talked to Dr. G about this, it's since the last semester, it's been a part of the fabric of getting excited about this day, because part of, I think, what he realizes, and part of what's really important, especially in line with what Dr. McClure just said, is that it's not about a day. It's about an ethos. It's about a way of being. It's about recognizing that this is a concern in the same way that they're already advertising for next year's football season. And it's, and it's 4 or 5 months, maybe 6 months away. I can't do the math right now, but it's a constant reminder that like we need to make this a priority. And it's kind of weaving it in, as you mentioned with the other departments that you were able to interview, that like if we really bring this to the fore as something that we are invested in, not just today, but that we start anticipating this day in the fall, and when we come back to class, that we make it at the fore. And so that's one thing that I'm thinking about in the longer run.
Well, I appreciate you all engaging in these rapid fire questions with me. My vote is to fly Dr. G in on a helicopter in the middle of the field. That one might be a little bit more suitable. But in the closing remaining moments, I would like to turn it over back to Dr. G for some closing comments and remarks. Panelists, audience members as well, we just want to thank you all for your time, energy, and effort in joining us in these important conversations about what does reconciliation mean to you all. Though this is the last and final official virtual town hall series, I hope and I will implore you all to continue the conversations wherever you are on campus. If it's in the classroom, if it's on your lunch break, just ask those very simple questions of what does reconciliation mean for you, for us, and as we move together. Dr. G.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. And thank you to our panelists. Dr. Williams, thank you so very much for your insight. And Dr. McClure, thank you so very much. I mean, and I'm also very appreciative of you overlooking my poorly worded question in the chat. That was poor grammar. I was rushing, but I appreciate you getting the sentiment. And the sentiment that we have to continue this conversation is one that I absolutely underscore. I'm so very thankful that you all joined this space. And so as you all can mute your screens, as I'm just going to share a couple of announcements. And that is that we are going to continue this work, not just on a local level with our campus, but also on a regional level. And so we would like to share with you that there's a link in the chat to the first ever Texas Summit on Reconciliation. We affectionately call it the Lone Star Summit, if you would. And it's going to take place this Friday from 1 to 3:30. Any or all who are interested in this work are invited to be a fly on the wall or be as vocal as they would like to be, as we are going to have a total of 9 Texas colleges and universities participating all throughout the state, sharing their ideas, their best practices, and also the challenges that they faced in undergoing the work. And so we're very excited to be the host of this inaugural event and see where it goes from here. Speaking of events that are growing, we'd also like to share with you, as mentioned earlier, that on the 20th of April, April 20th, we're going to have our second Reconciliation Day. So this seed is growing. And so what is Reconciliation Day, you might ask? Well, it's an opportunity for us to come together so we can move forward together. And not only that, but we want to reflect on what it takes to form a community, and what does that community look like, right? And so by way of description, the ceremony will take place at 11 a.m. in the Blue Auditorium. That's the Brown-Lupton University Union, the Blue Auditorium, first floor. That will take place from 11 to 12. And we'll have a program that consists essentially of three parts. The first third, if you will be an accounting of the 7 key recommendations that were unanimously approved by our Board of Trustees roughly last year this time. And we simply want to provide the public an update. Hey, what's been going on? What's been happening? We also wish to provide an update on the research that we've been doing this far. We're in year 2 of a 5-year plan, and we now have the Office of Diversity and Inclusion that is working directly with us to implement these recommendations. So we want to hear from individuals from these offices as well. And the second third, you'll be in for a treat, in that we get a chance to see our hairless leader lead us in a moderated panel discussion about the path towards reconciliation. What have we learned in undergoing numerous initiatives and efforts? What worked? What could be improved upon? And just we can just be transparent about how we're going about making this cake, and what's the formula. And so, for those of you who are interested to hear more about the pathway, you'll definitely be in for a treat, and also get a chance to see that our one of our leaders, our chancellor, is directly involved in participating in this conversation around reconciliation. The final third is something that you absolutely do not want to miss if you've been following the story this far, and that is the introduction, the reconnection, the opportunity to reckon and recognize 2 very powerful individuals who played a fundamental and instrumental role in the formation of TCU. And that was before it was in Waco, and that was when it started off in Thorpe Spring. And we're talking about the lives of Charlie and Kate Thorpe. They're 2 people of color who were indispensable, at least according to the historical receipts, as marked and noted by Randolph Clark in his book Reminiscences. And so Charlie and Kate Thorpe not only were instrumental to TCU's early growth days, but they also have a legacy of living descendants. And for the first time, we plan on having numerous living descendants of Charlie and Kate Thorpe come to our campus, and we have an opportunity to reconnect and reconcile with this part of our past. You don't want to miss it. And not only that, you don't want to miss from 12 to 1 the opportunity to engage in food, fellowship, and festivities, as we will have African drummers, Valley Folklorico, and also Native American drummers, in addition to food, refreshments, and treats, as we will be outside creating consciously the community that we desire, right? And finally, if you're interested in following what was happening with RI events, do know that this conversation is not just local, it's not just regional, but it's also taking on international proportions. The podcast, as the youth would say, is blowing up. And so feel free to check it out. For those of you who are fans of a football player, but I think he had a number 5 or something of that nature. I'm trying to remember his name. I think it rhymes with Mahamian Momlinson. I can't remember his name. I'm absent my professor, but at any rate, check out 413, his thoughts on reconciliation. Again, he's a Board of Trustee member, and to hear from LaDainian Tomlinson and his thoughts on reconciliation, the fact that it's still a subject that's important to him and important to others, this is what we wish to share. And so in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, we're so very appreciative of you making time for what's important and investing the time to even be a part of this podcast and be a part of this webinar and be a part of this conversation. And while we cannot at the end of the day promise what ultimately will happen as a result of us engaging in the efforts of reconciliation. Again, when we talk about this idea of getting excited, just as excited for a football game, still, even though we're just now in spring ball and we're several months away from the start of the season, there's a sense of hope in the air. The idea of a fresh new slate, a fresh new season, a fresh new start, a fresh new coach, a fresh new approach. The idea that there is this possibility. And so those same concepts, I firmly believe and underscore what our panelists share with us, can be applied to us when we're doing the work. It doesn't have to be all doom and gloom. I think many hands make the load light, and therefore your participation will help us move forward down the path towards reconciliation. And while I cannot ultimately promise what will happen, I do pledge to you that we are doing the best we can with what we have. Until next time.